It now gives me great pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker. I have known Professor Ryk Lewis for a while. He has been my supervisor in my master's degree, and he's going to be assisting me hopefully going forward with my doctorate. So Ryk and I are not just colleagues, but I would definitely count him as a friend. Ryk is at the Center for Applied Food Sustainability and Biotechnology at the Central University of Technology. If you don't know where that is, it's in Bloemfontein. And so Ryk has a number of students under him. He actually has the largest food safety group of students within South Africa. And so we've been collaborating on food safety culture for a few years now, since my master's. And so I thought, given what's happening in the country at the moment, that it would be a good time to talk about food safety culture, and also just having a look at how this particular situation can provide us with opportunities, positive opportunities. There's a lot of negativity at the moment. There's a lot of things that seem like doom and gloom. And there are concerns that we should definitely be managing, but how can we take a positive spin on this? How can we take this situation and actually use it to our benefit within our food safety management systems? But more importantly, today we're going to touch on the bigger picture aspects, and that being in relation to food security and securing the food supply chain. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the distinguished Professor Ryk. It's all yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Linda, and it's great to be here, and thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you and everyone that's listening in. It's really a great opportunity, and it's so wonderful to just share some ideas with you all, and thanks for your time that you've set aside to join us this morning. I'm going to continue to the second slide because in a way, I think this is what it's all about, and I've written kind of in a formula what I think the slide is about. And we've been saying that food safety culture is something that we wanted to promote beyond only systems and processes. You'll remember that we've been saying, Linda, you and I have been saying at some time that beyond only compliance, beyond only systems and processes and regulations and standards, what can we do in the food industry to ensure additional safety and additional performance? So if I can put that in one slide, Food Safety Culture 101, if you put it in a formula, it says C does not equal P, meaning that compliance does not necessarily equal performance. That just simply means that you can have all your systems in place, and the systems are very, very important. We know all of that. We know how important it is to comply in terms of getting your food risk down. But we know that there's still an opening, there's still a void there to ensure full performance. And we've seen that with certain companies that had full compliance, but still there were some outbreaks and some incidences of food safety. And that is where we start this presentation from, to say that Food Safety Culture 101 means that compliance does not always equal performance, which means what do we need to add to get that to add up, that formula to add up? So we've said in the past that why is this important? Why does the food industry need to perform and not only comply? I mean, if you comply, you say, but I mean, I'm out of trouble, I'm fine, I've got all my systems in place. But why is the P, why is the performance part necessary? Because lives and livelihoods are at stake. We've seen that with certain issues in the past. We've seen that people really lost their lives, they become gravely ill, and livelihoods as well. Livelihoods meaning the food industry as a whole, its effectiveness, its ability to provide us all with a standard safe environment. So if you look at what some of the people out there have been saying in terms of this, because we've not just said this in South Africa, it's a very wide process that's been happening. Frank Janas, that was with Walmart and Disney earlier, that's now in the regulatory environment, said long ago already, a few years, and many other workers in the food sphere as well, said that ensuring food safety beyond regulatory inspections, testing and training requires something, that's what you require to get the P there, the performance, It's a better understanding of organizational culture and human dimensions. And that you get through things like communicating expectations, education, realizing implications, and so forth. So we've been saying all along that this is important. What we've also been saying sometimes is that for us to make sure that we get to what Janas and Chris Griffith and Jesperson and all of these authors in the world says, is that we need to get a culture going, a culture that gets your staff members and your people that are involved in your organization to say that this is the way we do things around here, and to go the extra mile. So if you look at the definition of food safety culture, there's a number of those, the attitudes, values, beliefs, norms, behaviors that a particular group of people share in terms of food risk and safety. We talk about the term of organizational citizenship behavior, the way we do things around here. And now we're getting close to the COVID matter, which I will touch on just now. This was just a backdrop. The principle of Ubuntu, we are people because of other people. And this gets closer to the issue of the day and the theme of the day that actually relates to your co-worker in your company, your co-staff member, you as a management team, and how the principle of Ubuntu is coming out in terms of ensuring a safe food supply. Standing, for example, in the processing line next to a colleague, having to observe social distance, but also being at risk. And how does the principle of Ubuntu, it's such a nice South African word that I think says culture so nicely. So these are some of the matters that we're going to touch on today. So we've been saying this, that this is what the discussion is about, to discuss the people aspect, which is so important now with this COVID time. We are talking about really panic going around, people losing their jobs, being insecure. So the people part has really come to the fore in the last 2 or 3 or 4 months. So I believe very strongly, Linda, and I hope our colleagues will agree, that the issue of culture and a team spirit is now has become much more to the fore than it's been in the past. Something that we cannot really ignore, and that we'll have to be responsive to.
Absolutely, Rick. And I think that because we have such a lot of focus on our employees at the moment, I think that's why I felt that this was an ideal opportunity for us to talk about food safety culture. Because as you've said, you know, the researchers that have kind of gone before us have highlighted the fact that there are key requirements where we need to focus on the people side of the business, not just on the process side of the business. If we take, you know, the body of work that's out there and that's available, we've had the opportunity to look, or rather to review some of this work, and I think that many of the discussions relate around what is it that changes people's behavior, what is it that changes the people as opposed to just changing the process. And I think if we look at the, you know, the slide of the chain, if we think about our colleagues out there in the food industry, as a food safety manager or as a quality manager, we've been very focused on the processes and making sure that we're doing all the right things within the processes, but getting really frustrated when people don't do what the checklist says they have to do. And I think from a culture perspective, we need to look to the people side of it now to really understand why is it that people are not following the requirements. Now, what's changed within this COVID-19 pandemic, and how do you see that we now have an opportunity within our food safety culture management systems as a result of the pandemic, you know, going beyond just food safety, but now into a situation where we actually are just focused on our people?
Lynn, thank you so much. Yes, you're absolutely right. And you've been showing the list of workers internationally that we've been following that takes the lead in food safety culture. And interestingly, I haven't seen a lot of literature from those authors in the last 2 or 3 months, which I think makes our approach really unique and responsive as a country to say that we're going to come forward and say, let's take the lead in terms of getting our heads down. How does food safety culture relate or changes in this time of COVID. So if you look at the slide there, this has been a slide that we've used many times in presentations in the past, and we just called the individual here Sam. It could be male, female, any race, but we wanted to make a point about this is the typical food environment, and we asked the question in this case of what will influence a typical individual like that. That was now before COVID, in terms of going the extra mile. And the principle of this was that a typical worker in a food plant like this, like Sam, what will influence he or she to go the extra mile in ensuring a safe food product or to care for their consumers? And we said that it's unlikely, and we've got a lot of literature to support that. It's unlikely that it will be systems and process and rule and regulations or somebody watching over your shoulder. The matters that will bring a typical worker in a plant that also have got their own challenges at home, existentially, the things that will influence, or the variables or the constructs that will influence such a person to go the extra mile, are issues of compassion, of care. Just a line head asking the person, how are you today? Looking after your interest as well. So this has of course changed a little bit. If you probably take Sam to the current day environment in South Africa, it will probably look a little bit like this, or anywhere else in the world. The same environment. This is a rural farming environment. The difference, of course, as you all know, is now we've got the face masks on. And how has that impacted? Because the face, the so-called proverbial face of the worker has now changed. Another example, for example, in the food industry, just a random picture, it's totally different. Your informal chats with your colleague or your across the table has now been halted. You all have this kind of formal environment, and how are you managed coming to work every day like this, and how does that impact? So from Sam before, Sam in 2019 to proverbial Sam currently is a total different scenario. And how are we managing this? Or are we from the food industry merely saying that this is something that we can, it's business as usual, which we know it's not?
I think, Rake, if we look at the current pandemic, the focus within every business is on their staff because of occupational health and safety. So, of course, food safety is important, and I don't think that any food company would want to, take their eyes off food safety. I mean, we've seen coming from the National Directorate of Food Control, a warning or an encouragement to say, food safety is still paramount, and regardless of the additional measures that we have to introduce as an organization, we can't take our eyes off food safety. But currently we have to focus on our employees, and we have to take health and safety very seriously, because it's now Sam's well-being that is critically important. Because if Sam does contract COVID-19, it could mean that we have to actually shut this particular processing area down because his or her co-workers may have been infected. It could mean that we actually lose this entire line, and so therefore there's no product leaving the facility, regardless of our food safety management systems. And so I think what we, from the point that you made about compassion and valuing and caring for the employees, is now brought to the fore because of the current pandemic. But that's what food safety culture is also about. It's about making sure that employees understand that they are central to our food safety performance. We can have rules and regulations, but if they do not comply, if they do not follow them, if they don't buy in, if they're not caring about what they're doing, if they're not caring about their co-workers doing the right things, our food safety performance can suffer. And that's why I think COVID-19 does give us an opportunity to refocus on the culture of our organization. Because now, more than ever before, we do have to take responsibility for what we're doing when it comes to hygiene, but not only for ourselves, but for our fellow workers, and in terms of food security, for our fellow man. in that respect. Would you agree?
Definitely, it makes a lot of sense. You mentioned earlier, Lynn, in another discussion we had, it's also something that we'll probably get around a little bit later, is a new prioritization of what risk is. What we saw as risk earlier and what we saw as critical control points, and something that will take a lot of our energy and resources, is now repackaged into a different type of risk. And I think we need to be responsive to that as well. But luckily, if we say that our compassion to our fellow worker is an important aspect in ensuring a sustained food supply and a safe food supply, then it's something that is easier fixable, because it's a human construct than processes and system. Because sometimes just a compassionate word or something in support, or a system in support of your worker, will already achieve the goal. So if we move on and we look at what we said earlier in terms of what influences behavior, then I've listed, when I prepared the slide, all the things that, or the constructs that are, I think, emphasized with the COVID. And I had to take some time in getting some of those that are not really important, because you can just imagine the emotion that is underlying in many of these workers. We saw on the news some of the large meat processing plants in the US already closing the entire facility. We've seen South Africa, some entire facilities closing. Just imagine the emotion in terms of that workers about possibly getting sick, possibly losing their jobs. So if we look at the need for a job, or the need for good management and for leadership, just to set some of my fears at ease a little bit. Experience what we see, for example, on the news, what we experience maybe of a friend that went to hospital. Our environment when we come into our processing plant, is there PPE available, enough of those? How does that impact on my level of panic if I don't think that my management in my organization cares about me? So there's really, if you look at this slide that we've used in the past, we can almost tick all the boxes here and say all of them been emphasized and been elevated in this time of COVID. And that's what you've been saying, Linda, that it's just more of an emphasization of what we've been saying all along.
And I think when you look at this slide, the interesting thing is, for the first time, health and safety and food safety have an opportunity to work together. And I think this has often been a problem in many of the companies that I've worked with. You have a food safety management system that's normally under the control of the quality manager, or possibly even a person who's known as the food safety manager. But in most companies where I've worked, you then have a separate health and safety department. And it's just very interesting if you take the two different approaches. Health and safety would be considering the health of the worker, whereas when we talk about food safety, we're actually thinking of the well-being of the consumer. But we need to make sure that we achieve the well-being of the consumer through the same people that the health and safety department would be wanting to protect. And I have been in discussions where we actually disagree on certain requirements. You know, health and safety are most concerned about people wearing safety shoes. Food safety want to make sure that people are washing their hands. And now, interestingly enough, health and safety want people to wash their hands just as much, maybe even more, than food safety wanted them to wash their hands. And I think this is a fundamental opportunity that we need to take into account during this pandemic situation. Within a strong food safety culture, we do recognize the need for a supportive team. And, you know, given that all of these aspects influence our behavior, if as functional heads, we recognize the need to work as a team and roll out requirements in a consistent team approach, we have a unique opportunity now to strengthen the organizational culture by bringing those two departments together, but even other departments, you know, and formally working in a consistent approach rather than working in the previously fragmented approach that you know, that we have had. You mentioned something else which I think is really important, and that is the media. So yes, there have been companies overseas which have been obviously very seriously impacted, but we've seen workers speaking out very strongly within American organizations where they feel that companies are not taking care of them. They haven't been providing appropriate PPE, you know, they are sort of threatening to take legal action. Now, and I think the same could be in some South African companies where employees just don't feel that they are cared for, and they're experiencing the stress as a result of what they're seeing on the media. They're having to go to work in a taxi, they're having to take their lives literally into their hands on a daily basis, but yet when they get to work, they don't feel valued and they don't feel cared for. And I think that's an area where, from a food safety culture perspective, now gives us an opportunity to work on that area. Because if we don't have healthy employees, we won't have any production and we won't have a business. It's as simple as that. So there is a real business risk that's associated with our employees' well-being. And so it is most definitely an area that we should be focusing on, because it impacts, as you said, on food safety, not only on food safety culture, but it actually impacts on food security within our country. Ryk, I think one of the challenges that companies must be facing is, I almost want to say, competing risks. There are now additional risks, or rather additional costs. I have to provide additional PPE. How do I effectively implement social distancing? We've heard of, you know, people having to change their shift structure, providing staff transport, taking responsibility for cleaning that transport. So we have a situation now where the resources have to be spread. I now have to spend money on staff well-being, and could that cause a situation where it's competing for food safety resources? You know, are we sacrificing food safety controls just to survive? And I think here we were chatting about the role of the enforcer, you know, even the role of the auditor or the consultant in terms of recognizing and understanding some of these constraints and where do we draw the line when it comes to food safety, and where do we draw the line when it comes to worker well-being?
Yes, no, you're absolutely correct, Linda. I don't think from my side, and being in academia, maybe I can say this, is that I don't think this is really the time for us to protect our areas so vigorously. And if I say areas, I mean, you know, drawing this clear line between what is OHS and the relevant legislation, what is food security, what is food safety, what is a microorganism. You know, a virus is not really a microorganism, so it does not resort under this category or that category. And let's spare a thought for the employers as well as the employees, having to make some kind of sense between all of this convoluting ideas and then still try and keep their, you know, their doors open. I really think this is not the time to be pedantic about, you know, all of these matters. And as you mentioned, the one is OHS. This is how it's impacting, and that's a no-go area. I've had some discussions with owners of companies that are really in the dark about what they can and what they cannot do, while trying to keep their doors open. And I think from the food safety perspective and the people that are really passionate about food, we need to take this, you know, at heart. So if we continue with our discussion, you just said, Lillian, you just mentioned the whole principle of convoluting risks. And it's interesting, if you look at some of the definitions out there, I think this is a very important slide for me, because if you think in the past, we've very clearly separated aspects of nutrition with food security, with food safety, with production, And we've kind of worked in all our different areas very, very specifically. But if you look at the definition of codex, for example, of at least how the WHO uses the definitions, and that's taken from the WHO strategic document. It says food security is commonly understood as the state where all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, nutritious, and safe food. So that is the definition of the WHO. At least there's other definitions of codex that's a little bit different, and of the FAO and so forth. So if you look at and I've said to someone the other day, if you look at COVID, it's unlikely that COVID will make will distinguish between these, these aspects. So we will have to have a general approach where we look at the broader picture, I think. And the other day I've been talking to somebody about the principle of food microbiology, and that a food risk or a food spoilage being done by an organism or being caused by an organism during the processing chain. And we were talking about the fact that COVID is a virus, and it spread not maybe on the food, but it spread during the processing line. We've seen that in some of the meat companies. So now we may become pedantic about definitions and say, but it's a virus, it's not really bacteria, so it falls out of that field. It is carried along the food chain, but it's not really carried on the food chain, so we don't see it in this category or that category. I think this is not the time to be, pedantic about definitions like that, and that we need to have an integrated approach, exactly as you mentioned, to try and assist our food workers, employees, and our employers through this time. We've had a discussion, and this was a picture that we received from Frank Janas showing the Walmart farm to fork, and I think this was just a very brief mention that I wanted to make with regard to not only how there's an intermingling of different aspects of risk, but having a much broader aspect of bringing the farm to fork continuum to the fore. Because if we are saying we are looking at nutritional aspects, if we say we're looking at food security aspects and food safety aspects, it now also has got an impact on all of those aspects of the value chain. So where an aspect maybe or a variable in the past were not a risk because it was not seen as part of, let's say, the food safety aspect, but maybe rather primary production on the farm or on informal farms, or like maybe on small scale places where people produce informal foodstuffs, community gardens and so forth. There's a new risk there that was not previously a risk. So this also widens laterally, also widens our interest much broader, where we would have focused maybe, let's say, mostly on retail. We have to open now and say, let's look at the entire value chain. So what I've done is to just look at what is trending. And you mentioned, Linda, about what is in the news. And I think we've been all very, very under the intense scrutiny and the having to ensure ourselves what is fake news and what is real news out there. I think it's also been a learning curve for all of us in terms of distinguishing between different sources of information. But I've just, in terms of having this discussion about the broader impact of farm to fork, I've just taken direct quotes from some of the material out there, and you can also very easily find these. That's FAO documents, that's some Codex documents, World Health Organization, the World Hunger Program, and so forth. And these are some of the comments that's been out there in the media for right or wrong. For example, if you look what's trending, currently there's no evidence that coronavirus can be transmitted via food or packaging. That brings, that's a comment for right or wrong. We know that there are different opinions about this. There's research coming out about this, but this is some of the conclusions that's out there. And this has made us to believe that the food safety aspect, as per definition, may not be as under threat as the food security aspect, for example. But again, that is statements that's made that's sometimes proven or wrongly proven in terms of its actual outcome. So that's one of the trending statements that's out there that we have to deal with whether true or not. So this is immediately putting a certain risk perspective of, let's say, that part of the processing line out there in the public domain. Another comment, research on different surfaces reported that viruses can remain viable. We've seen that research for certain times, and on plastic for as it's indicated there, 24 hours on cardboard. But what is interesting, that statement that's made there is kind of against the previous statement, because it says it cannot be transmitted by food or packaging, which means that now it opens a lot of questions over there for example, producers to say it cannot be transmitted, but it can survive. So if you say it can be transmitted, but it can't survive, what does that mean? So there's different research coming out there, and I think some of these are not integrated. If you look at another point, number 3, there, COVID may disrupt formal, informal food change, logistics, supplies, potentially doubling global food insecurity and chronic hunger by end of 2020. That was something that was measured in the one of the recent WHO reports that paints a very grave picture out there that sometimes also we don't see from social media, especially in some political realms, that says this thing is over and it's fine, we can move on. Another statement, the most vulnerable groups are the urban poor, inhabitants of remote areas, migrants, the informally employed, people in conflicted areas with comorbidities and compromised health. That one we know it's out there. Again, a very strong statement that asks questions about how are we attending to the urban poor. We know that some of our food workers, for example, in some of our plants come from some of these areas. They come from remote areas. You mentioned this, Lynn. How do we respond to this? Another statement there at the bottom of the page, COVID-19 may prove especially deadly for people suffering from chronic or acute hunger or dietary defects. Immediately you get this convolution of principles where a food provision and the aspect of food provision is now an aspect of food that comes to the fore and poses a risk that competes with aspects of sustainability, of safety and quality. How do we manage these issues? A few other trending comments that I've picked up that you can probably have all seen. The primary challenge with food and COVID is that labor issues from farm to fork will culminate into absenteeism, lower production, price hikes, and loss of income, which relates directly again to our food security and a sustained food supply. An emerging challenge is the reduction of feeding programs as rollout, aid workers, assistants being suboptimal, and regulators being understaffed. We've seen that, I think in the US, there's already a huge number of environmental health officers that is off sick and that's infected that cannot attend to this. So I don't know if we are sparing thoughts for the regulators that is out there in the front lines, and that our regulation, you mentioned this, Linda, earlier, our regulation aspect is maybe not what it should be in terms of people coming around and checking up and auditing. The food sector is increasingly resorting to negative coping strategies that we've also seen in the media. Dumping of food, panic buying, stocking lower grade products in some cases, reallocating resources toward primary risk mitigation rather than quality assurance. Linda, you mentioned this, that if it's an either or, then you need to make a choice and then your resources will go to your highest risk. Adaptive consumer trends, we're seeing those are emerging to avoiding gatherings. These include online buying and delivering, avoiding restaurants, events, to informal supply, rather retail. We've seen this in many of our townships, informal areas that starts selecting to buy from street food vendors because it's only a one-on-one interaction than rather going into a big retail environment. Reduced movement and trade, we've seen that, which is interesting, which is actually directly in competition with our call for social distancing, where there's been a lot of calls out to the food sector that says, please continue your trading, please keep your doors open, please don't lock out certain people that need to trade, while there's also calls for saying you must close, you must not move, there mustn't be transport between borders and so forth. How do we manage these things? preventing contamination. And this is kind of positive, and I want to finish this slide. Say preventing contamination in the food chain will reduce foodborne illness and also reduce the likelihood of emergence of novel diseases such as COVID. So that's something that's positive, because it says that it suggests that our focus on COVID and ensuring social distancing and cleanliness will also have positive outcomes for our food safety and food hygiene mandate that we've also been trying to push. So maybe that is a positive, because the two seem to be interrelated, and then you know, one can maybe capitalize on this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you know, again, I've seen that as a real positive coming out of the pandemic. If people are having to wash their hands as frequently as what we're being called to, isn't that what we wanted them to do in the first place? And the difference being now is they have a personal motivation to do so. It's their personal responsibility to maintain their health. And so they want to wash their hands. But in that is a key factor when it comes to food safety culture, because we want people to understand that they should want to wash their hands because of the personal responsibility that they have for the consumer's well-being. In this current situation, we are now re-emphasizing the need for them to wash their hands in order to protect their own well-being and to take into account their co-workers' well-being. So if anything, this situation is forcing us to think about each other. It's forcing us to think about how our behavior impacts on each other, and the fact that if our behavior is incorrect, we stand the chance of the business having to close, and that will result in food not being available. So I think the current situation allows us an opportunity for conversations which are a lot more, which carry a lot more weight. I think in our current food safety training, when we talk about why we do things, we often are confronted by the statement, but we haven't killed anyone. I always put the end of that statement as being yet, or as far as you know, because I think that's a very short-sighted statement, and I think the listeriosis outbreak definitely requalified that statement for many companies. But this situation requalifies it in a slightly different context, because now Sam knows about the impact on the virus. He may or she may have a friend or a family member who's contracted the virus. He or she may be very aware that there are family members that are not able to work because of the lockdown, but yet he or she is in the fortunate position that they're still able to go to work, although there is a risk. But that the management of my behavior while I'm at work is so critical to ensure that I continue to have a job, but more importantly, we continue to supply food to the rest of South Africa. You know, we've seen food riots, we've seen all sorts of things where there's all of a sudden a shortage of food, you know, as a result of the pandemic. And so these things are now not just somewhere else in the world. These discussions, these stories that we need to be talking about are happening on our own doorsteps. And I think, to me, that's really important when we're having discussions on the shop floor now. It's not talking about an American situation or UK statistics. We're actually talking about our country, our food supply, our customers, our consumers, and your colleagues, my colleagues, the people that are working around me. How am I taking, you know, care of those? And so I definitely think we should not waste the crisis, because the crisis can spur change. And so it gives us an opportunity to build and strengthen our food safety culture during this time. And please, this is not about ticking boxes for your next FSSC 22000 audit. This is it's a far deeper requirement within your organization. I'm not wanting to have this conversation just because of your next audit. I think that we need to look at what can we do to strengthen our food safety performance, and how can we use our food safety culture model to do just this? So in the model that we've been working on, we have identified that there are 5 areas within the business that we would look at to determine the maturity, if you like, of that food safety culture. And we have the vision of the organization, and I think here we have a very clear role that must be played by leadership. Rake will talk a little bit more about that. It also talks about how does the company communicate, what are the expectations with regards to food safety. If we take the current situation and we bring in the COVID-19 pandemic, what clear communication channels have we set up within our organization? Are we communicating more with our staff now than we ever have before? Purely because we need them to understand that it's so important that they do the right things in order to protect themselves and to protect the business. And this is a unique opportunity, because if we haven't communicated properly before, how can we use these communication channels going forward to assist us with our food safety programs? How are we inspiring our staff to take ownership and personal responsibility for their health during this time? In a strong, positive food safety culture, we would have a personal commitment as far as staff are concerned with regards to the role that they play in food safety. Again, the importance of leadership at all levels to make sure that their staff are committed, that they are involved, and that they participate. In this situation, how have we done that? How have we made sure that everyone in the business understands what is required? How are we ensuring trustworthiness, compassionate leadership? Are your managers involved, and are they talking to staff personally to inspire them to stay committed? You saw that some of the challenges around the world have been increased levels of absenteeism. People just don't want to come to work because they're too scared to come to work. And the importance that leadership plays in ensuring that staff are loyal and they want to be a part of this process because they feel cared for. Empowering them with the relevant resources, whether that's PPE, support mechanisms that we need to have in place now in order to ensure that people can achieve the expected behaviors. Our food safety management system at this time is really an important backbone, because we have a personal hygiene code of conduct. How can we use this tool? How can we use our policies? How can we use the procedures that we have? And instead of it just being in a file, they now actually have to work on the floor. And how many of you have actually looked at those things and found that actually the way we wrote them is completely impractical? And this situation has forced us to look at the practicalities of our control measures. And to me, that's one of the important things that we often take for granted. Just because I wrote this procedure, it must be right. And as the quality manager, I know what's best for the system. But now that you've actually had to challenge some of those procedures, emergency preparedness, for example, now you recognize that it actually is flawed. And now we can fix it. And that's great. And that's the opportunity that you should be capitalizing on. How are we monitoring things? How are we evaluating the successful outcomes of our policies and procedures? What we should have in place is a workable system that people can engage with. If it's too hard to practice food safety, people won't do it. If it's too hard to practice health and safety in the current situation, people won't do it. And so now we have to make sure that they are doing the right things. So how can we make it as easy as possible? And then, of course, the appetite to change. How easy have you found it to change? How's the team worked together, and has this situation taught us some valuable lessons about our teamwork and areas where we actually need to look at things differently, and maybe we need slightly different training. It's no longer just about technical training, but maybe we need soft skills training, maybe we need teamwork training, maybe we don't just need team building sessions, but we actually need conflict management. We need proper negotiation skills. We need proper, communication tools so that we can actually work together better as a team, because that's the thing that's actually let us down in the past. And this situation has in fact highlighted that. So those are the areas where we feel that this situation with the pandemic helps us to actually get some clarity. Those are the areas that we would be focusing on within the business in terms of your food safety culture. And these are areas where you can definitely put more attention and use these aspects to in fact improve not only your food safety performance at this time, but general compliance with what's required for for the social distancing and health and safety requirements. Rick, you've written recently quite a bit about the role of the boss, the leader in this situation.
Yeah, Linda, thank you for that. You've mentioned in the previous slide many aspects of organizational culture that can lead to success and performance and can change this thing around. But I thought I just wanted to highlight one or two aspects that I think is really important, and I wanted to reiterate what you said without going into too much detail, and that is the role of leadership. It's been widely published that and widely agreed that proper leadership and management, but leadership, more leadership than management, is still and remains your single most important requirement for success in any project. And that in the COVID, we're going to see that. We've already seen that so far. And apparently this originated from the old Latin or somewhere hundreds of years ago, tens of years ago, that the definition for a good boss or a good leader is pathos, logos, and ethos. And pathos standing for empathy. For you to be a good leader, first of all, you need to have empathy. And we've seen that if you are empathetic to your fellow man, you can even put your mask, wrongly on. People don't care because you had empathy, you cared for people. And that is something that I miss, and I've missed for a long time, even before COVID, is managers and leaders that have empathy for their consumers, for their workers, for their fellow man. Now, I understand if you we all understand that if you are struggling to survive and keeping your doors open, it's not always easy to walk down the corridor to some of your employees and talk to them about an environment of empathy and issues of empathy. How are they doing and so forth? But this is really important, and this culminates into a positive culture. And at the end of the day, it culminates into performance. So it's a means to an end. And together with that, logos, which means logic leadership. Leadership that's logical, that makes sense, and that you can base on good information. Not just decisions that are haphazard and that you don't understand. Logic leadership, and then ethos means ethical leadership. Leadership that looks at the ethics of the environment, the right thing at the right time, at the right place. So this is important, and it's actually so simple if you think about it. That if our bosses and our leadership can start paying attention to these three aspects of leadership, empathy, logical, and ethical leadership, then I think it will make a big difference. As you said, we've written a part on this, so we kind of dissected a little bit what we think this means for the food industry. Be real, be compassionate, be involved. I see so many leaders and bosses, being isolated in their offices, not getting on the shop floor, not only even the food industry, lots of other environments. I sometimes wonder with the lockdown, how many bosses have just phoned their staff members and said, how are you doing? Are you fine? How's your kids doing? Is your family doing? A simple little thing like that makes a huge difference. Brave, positive, and energetic. I don't think this is really the time to withdraw and not be involved, because the fact, if you're a leader, because there's a lot of people looking up to you for guidance. Lead by example. We've seen leaders across the world in social media and locally, not wearing masks, for example, because they are above this, or apparently claiming to be above this infection. They don't wash their hands. It's as if they don't worry about this. This is only for the people. This can't be the case. You need to lead by example. Adapt and innovate. We've said that this is not business as usual anymore. You cannot handle this matter, this issue, this outbreak. You cannot handle it the way that you've handled stuff last year or the year before. You need to be innovative. You need to think out of the box. You need to be responsive. And then, of course, lastly, you're still the boss and you've got access to resources that your people and your employees don't have. Where are you going to put these resources? How are you going to prioritize these resources to put the resources at the right place, attending to the right risk at the right time? So I just wanted to put this slide in, which I think is of critical importance, Linda. Then if we continue, and we're moving towards the end, is to say, you know, if we look at the different aspects and recommendations in literature, there's ample literature out there moving onwards to some new ways of doing things, making some new suggestions, and I think we should heed these, and we should also implement those. So looking at the previous slide on management, this slide provides some hints and some ideas to improve the culture, and maybe to look at this COVID incidents in a little new light, and maybe that we all overcome it. Firstly, communication, as you mentioned, is important. Care is important. Support is important from leadership. Very, very important. We cannot emphasize that enough. And then in this case, equip with adequate personal protective equipment. I think it's a very important aspect that now becomes an aspect of care rather than a compliance matter. If I now hand out to my staff good quality masks, it's not just a compliance matter, it's also a matter of care and a matter of compassion, because I'm protecting not only my business, not only my sustained food supply to my consumer, but I'm also protecting my staff. So a compliance matter has become a matter of culture, and this is really interesting. There's very practical matters that we can look at, staggering and separation of workspaces, and also canteens, some of the leisure areas, where you put in groups of people rather than look again at the shifts, the timing of your factory, so that you can observe social distancing and still ensures a continued supply. Adaptive signage and labeling. We've seen that in some of the retail outlets where you've got these little circles. You must stand there. It must be 2 meters or 1.5 meters away from the client or the consumer ahead of you, and also creating awareness in front of you, awareness all around in the processing environment, but a positive environment, a positive awareness, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The aspect of training is something that I've not seen a lot of people talking about, which I think really poses a huge challenge for the food industry, is our novel and responsive training. Training on aspects that now relates to COVID and COVID spreading in addition only to what we've taught in the past. And I haven't seen a lot of this going around. Training on aspects like epidemiology, which was in the past unthinkable. Why would you train staff members of a large processing plant in aspects of epidemiology? It wasn't needed in the past. Now it is. Understanding how diseases spread, understanding how to limit the spread of the disease in your domestic environment and not bring it to work. If you're part of management, how to manage your different areas in your factory to reduce epidemiological spread and so forth. Life skills training in terms of basic aspects that may have been not in the past as important. How do you heed certain aspects of our social support systems for your family at home so that they don't get infected, and you don't get infected, and you don't infect the rest of the people at work. Skills expansion, let's hope it doesn't really go there. But really, going out there and saying, if we need to close as a company, we need to equip our workers with additional skills so that they can find other work out there. I hope that this is not really going to become really a reality. But these are the type of skills development and training programs, and there are many more, of course, that we need to look at. Training programs in terms of how to handle foodstuffs, you know, the basics of food safety, of cutting boards and sharing cutting boards with different color coding, the basics that we've learned, to revisit those and look at what the implication would be for the viral spread. Very important is to, and this is in contrast with the whole idea of social distancing, but from management side, maintain trading and dealing. Because if you maintain trading and dealing, you keep your doors open, you'll keep the supply open, and you can just at least survive in a way. And to balance that maintaining of trading and dealing with observing social distancing. Revisit offtake systems and channels. We've seen many of this farming communities, subsistence farmers, community gardens, starting to have other takeoffs. They will start selling person to person. They will start selling their products from street vendors, not to retail anymore. So there's something in there that one can be innovative about. Effective monitoring and tracing is something that I've been thinking about myself, that we have our sampling systems as part of our compliance and auditing processes, FSSC and so forth. But confronting the issue of testing and monitoring for COVID and other infections as part of your staff surveillance system, I think has got new impetus now. And then to finish off is to start from leadership side, to see some positives out of this. You mentioned earlier, let's not waste the crisis, and I've just thought, you know, create a culture of conquering rather than panic and fear. Because if we start, you know, distributing that message out there, you know, that will not help. So I wrote this down, and it just, you know, it rhymed, and I didn't plan it to rhyme, to say, let's create a culture of COVID conquering rather than panic and fear. This is a way we do things over here. Meaning we are going in our company, we are going to take this thing on, we are taking this together, we care for one another, and this is the type of culture we want out there. So I think we had a discussion earlier in the past talking about the types of work relationships that you would want to have with your company, and I think finishing off, this is where I want to focus on, is the trust-based interaction is where we want to go with our employer, which is the top best interaction that we have. And this is the question that we must ask ourselves. We must ask it as food industry. We must ask it as employees on the shop floor. Do I trust my employer to look after my best interest? Do I trust consultants? Do I trust the academia to try their best in setting aside differences and keeping us all in this together, and let's get through this together? Do I trust government to look after my best interest? That is very, very important, much more important than it was a year ago. This is not the time to just have a service offering interaction with your client, with your employees. The bottom, where your employees come in, they do work and they leave. So, and this is my appeal, is that we start moving into a direction of trust. Let's trust our regulators, let's trust each other, let's trust our fellow employees and our leaders and managers, and we'll get through this together. Lynn, you wanted to take over?
Thanks, Rick. Sorry, my mouse wasn't behaving the way that it was supposed to be behaving at that point. I think the comment that you made regarding trust is absolutely fundamental, because that's the basis of a strong food safety culture too. Do our employees trust us to take food safety seriously? And if we can show them that we take their health and safety seriously, we can build on that in terms of showing them that they can trust us to take food safety seriously. And I think what's being challenged at the moment in many companies is that trust. Do we really trust our employers to take our best interests at heart? And I think that requires quite a bit of introspection in terms of management teams at the moment. We've had one comment coming in from Leanne. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks for joining us today. She's made a comment about the fact that their initiative for COVID has really been driven by their food safety team. It would be interesting to know how many other companies have been in the same situation, and then working with the OHS coordinator, the health and safety person, but it's really been driven from the food safety management system. I've had several interactions with companies in the last couple of weeks where the questions have definitely been coming from the food safety team and how to use the food safety management system to actually leverage to manage the crisis. And while I agree with what Rake's saying in terms of let's be positive, I think what is important is to make sure that you take the situation seriously enough. And in many risk assessments, I think we've been possibly a little too positive in our reckoning of risk, and we should be a little bit more, or rather test the significance of those risks in a potential shutdown. I think what's important as far as food safety culture is concerned is we would obviously like to assist you. If you need to know more information, please won't you reach out to us in this regard. We'd be very happy to continue the conversation by email. We want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. I know that for some of you, you're locked down, and so you have the opportunity to spend time with us. For others of you, when I look at the names, you're still hard at work doing the right things for us as citizens of South Africa to make sure that we've got food on the shelves. And for that, we really would like to say thank you so much for your continuing efforts, your loyalty, for continuing to do all the right things. We know that you're doing your best to maintain food safety. You're doing your best to maintain the standards under what is quite trying conditions. For those of you that have experienced employees already tested positive for COVID, we're really thinking about you guys, because we know that that puts additional strain on the organization. And I think at the end of the day, this is going to do a lot to our culture as a country, and we're looking to positive spin-offs. And so as Food Focus, as foodsafetyculture.coza, we really would like to encourage you. We'd like to kind of tell you that we're behind you, and we wish we could be doing more in a very stressful situation, but we do acknowledge what you're doing, and you're our food safety heroes, and we sincerely appreciate your efforts. Thanks for being with us. Any last words from your side, Rake?
No, I can just echo what you said, Lynn. Thanks for everyone, and thanks for keeping out there, and for not sparing any effort in ensuring a safe food supply. And thanks for attending, and I hope you all go well and stay safe.